midst of them. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 up there. We almost have, if we had 12, we'd be able to have a synagogue. So we're doing very well. Thank you very much for coming. I don't even need to introduce Gail, because everybody here is well aware of her, and she is what I would call a friend of the congregation. And in fact, I have to say to our church secretary, no, Marcina, don't send her the envelope with the pledge cards in it, because she's pledging somewhere else. And then Marcina will say, "Are you sure?" And I say, "Well, I could talk to her about it." I'm sorry, I jest. And so I am just going to say that Gail and her husband, Ed, Diane, and I sat around the table at our house, eating dinner and listening to Gail's stories. And I am telling you, she has been places, done things, initiated things, women's programs, stuff like that, that is absolutely mind-boggling. And so I'm going to invite Gail to come up and boggle our mind. Come, O thou boggler, come.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Reverend Jack, and my friend Joyanne, and this one. Okay.
That's it. I could just tell that's what Winnie was thinking.
All right, and thank you, folks online. And thank you for coming out on a beautiful autumn day. So, if I can use this clicker, we're going to be in business. Oh, that was good. All right. So, what is the realistic meaning of peace in our lives on the national level, on the world level? I wanted to first talk about the different dimensions of peace, or terminology, because it can be rather confusing. We have peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, and Global Peace Foundation has introduced peace sharing. So 4 dimensions of peace, and that's where we're going to start today. So peacekeeping is pretty much for hot conflict. And peacekeeping is done usually by some kind of military force, the UN peacekeepers. And basically, it's like literally, okay, you go there, and stop. So that's peacekeeping. A lot of people have asked me, because of my work, what am I doing in the Middle East? And I'm like, I wish I could do something. I'm praying for the Middle East, but I will get, in a moment, I'll be at the dimension that I'm working in. But so this is peacekeeping, and then peacemaking. For a long time, it was very much in the purview of diplomats and governments, making peace treaties and diplomacy. A good example of this that usually involves mediation. A good example is the Good Friday Agreement. So for a long time, it's been just diplomats and government and people like us are thinking, we can't do anything about this, but in fact, it's trickling down more and more civil society organizations, and I feel like it's really coming down to grassroots level, that when we can, have a intense desire for peace, then we can build peace in our communities, and it can go up, not just top down, but bottom up. I think that's when we're finally going to have it. So that was peacemaking, but let me see. There. For example, with the Good Friday Agreement, that's peacemaking, but yet that even still, after that, there's still a long way to go. That governments, treaties, diplomacy, this does not remove hatred from the human heart. How does one help those on either side who have been wronged or victimized to forgive? This doesn't happen with a piece of paper. So following peacemaking is a long-term peace building. And that's what peace building is working on reconciliation and bringing things back to normalizing relations. So after the Good Friday Agreement, I went to Belfast a number of times, and actually, so the hot conflict was over, the peacemaking had happened, but they've been working on peace building for a long time. And actually now there are more peace walls built in Belfast than there ever were. And 10 times as many peace walls. And in fact, they have walls that when they do these parades and historical memorial kind of things, they can actually raise the walls for, remotely raise them, because they know that this is when emotions are high. So peace building is the only dimension that we're talking about, that actually dimension of peace that it can be preventative. Peace building can take place before a conflict, and if we have good peace building, good social cohesion, it is truly preventing violent conflict. Peace building can also be during hot conflict, in the midst of hot conflict, to attempt to contain the violence. There is peace building going on in the Middle East, and some NGOs that we have partnered with, we're still in contact with them, and I just cry when I get their emails, because it just blows me away that in the middle of all that, they are absolutely committed to dialogue and to being able to work things out in some way. It's a very special organization that I'm referring to, but anyway. And so even after the conflict, that's when there's a lot of peace building work to be done. And the times when I went to Ireland, there were many organizations working on peace building. Oh, oops, I gotta get used to this thing. Okay. So sometimes, I don't know if I just said this, but so there's this terminology and these dimensions, but they're not neatly divided like that. They can merge and one can go into the other. For example, in Nigeria, our chapter there had a wonderful peace building initiative called One Family Under God. That was what they wanted to call their campaign, and they have a lot of conflict between Christian and Muslim the communities. And So they did a peace building project there, and it was very successful. They would go into the villages, talk to the traditional chiefs, and with their blessing, they would gather the leaders of the village together and do like a 3-day workshop. And it was very successful, so much so that word got out. And in the southern part, they were working in Kaduna State, which we targeted that because that's sort of a microcosm of Nigeria. It's like kind of 50-50 Christian-Muslim. But there had been so much conflict that there were so many no-go areas where businesses had left and there was no contact between the communities. But it was very successful. Word got out. So down in the south, you may have heard there's a lot of hot conflict in the southern part of Kaduna State. In the northern part is where you heard about Boko Haram, right? But in the southern part, the farmers and the herdsmen, Fulani herdsmen, had hot conflict going on. So the people down there heard about what we were doing, and they asked for our team to come down, which they did. And then, our team was saying, okay, this is hot conflict, what do we do? So we said, well, first have meetings with the oppositional groups separate, and work with them until you think you can bring them together. Anyway, long story short, they did, and they facilitated 2 ceasefires. So this is just an example of as one merges into the other, as I was saying. And the last dimension is peace sharing. And this is a term that Cooperation Ireland, which is an NGO that we worked with, they came up with this term because although every conflict is very complex and very layered, nevertheless, there is actually a lot in common. There's a lot to share between people that are working on in the various areas. So Global Peace Foundation is in 21 countries, so we have this transnational network, and we are more able to really get this new term out there and actually be peace sharing. And when that team went down into the southern part of Kaduna, we called the Irish team and said, you got some advice for us because we're going into hot conflict here. And so we were really able to actualize that peace sharing. And often it's not just what to do, it's also what not to do, right? So, let me see. As I was mentioning before, I really see times changing where peacemaking and peace building and peace sharing is really happening more and more on a grassroots level. And I think that's ultimately how we're going to work this all out, is top down and bottom up. So, Reverend Jack asked me specifically to share the story about Kenya. I had an amazing experience in June, at the end of June this year. Went to Nairobi, so I'll try to share that story concisely. So our conference there was along the theme of African Renaissance, because as the continent was colonized, am I speaking too loud? No, I'm okay? Okay. As the whole continent was colonized by by England, France, Belgium, different countries, one of the great tragedies was that the African traditional philosophy was very much decimated, lost, except on different levels. But So what's happening now, there's kind of a new movement in the continent of Africa to regain and to recapture the original traditional way of life and philosophy, African philosophy. And I could talk the rest of the evening about Ubuntu, which is the overall term for the traditional way. But it's very, very much an interconnection between people, very strong community. What's it called? Restorative justice. That is very fascinating and beautiful, the restorative justice aspect. So that's what our conference was about. My role at the conference, what I've been doing for the last 20 years at our conferences and conventions, is to put together the peace building track, which is a whole day of workshops and plenaries and sharing and learning and bringing in speakers, depending if it's international or how international the conference is. And so we have a day of our conferences where there's concurrent tracks going on. There's an education track, there's an environmental, women's track, youth track, and mine is the peace building track, my responsibility. So it takes months to prepare that and to invite the speakers, and I expect about 100 in the audience, depending on which country is hosting. So went there, and the day before the conference began, we had a big brainstorming session about this initiative that I was just mentioning, the Ubuntu, the African Renaissance. And we had wonderful, like, spiritual giants and high-level leaders agreeing to come, and came from 12 to 14 different countries in Africa. So it wasn't just about Kenya. It wasn't just Kenyans. It was a continental thing. And we had this great brainstorming session. So that was on Tuesday, and the conference was to start on Wednesday. And take note that the president of Kenya was our keynote and was opening our conference. We were having a high-level plenary with most of the big shot leaders, and the president were organizing all this, and that was to happen Wednesday morning. So on Tuesday, while we were having this brainstorming meeting, unbeknownst to us, at the same time, there was a protest that was building momentum in downtown Nairobi. Thousands and thousands of young people gathered through social media about a tax bill that the president was pushing and the parliament was pushing through. And it was a stupid tax bill. It was putting taxes on bread and oil and things that the everyday folks were really going to suffer from if this bill went through, So there was all the young people gathered to protest, and this is happening all over Africa, which, I don't know if you're up on African news. In America, you don't get much international news. You have to make a lot of effort if you want to know what's going on in the world. But at any rate, thousands and thousands of young people were gathering. They had legitimate concerns, but there was a group of radical young people that at some point took the protest in a much more radical vein, and they stormed the Parliament building. They set fire inside the building, and things were getting really out of hand. But the president called the army out, and he told them to open fire. So, like 23 of these young people were killed, and as I mentioned, these weren't riffraff. I mean, they were young people with good families and going to college and all. So it was really a huge, huge tragedy. And so I got this text as I was in this meeting, and the text was, "Don't let anyone leave the hotel." And I was like, whoa. And so we didn't know totally what was going on. So later on that night, the chairman of Global Peace Foundation was watching the president was giving his address, after the protest. And he recounted the situation with no compassion, totally cold, and he said, well, we got everything under control. Unfortunately, 23 young people were killed, but they were criminals anyway, and just completely cold-hearted. So the chairman of Global Peace Foundation said, uninvite him. And a lot of the Kenyan leadership and different other chapter leaders in Africa were all gathered around, and they were just shocked. And the Kenyan in particular, the leaders, we always do things in partnership. Global Peace Foundation, we don't do things alone. We always have a coalition and work for collective impact. So the Kenyans were like, whoa, you can't disinvite our president. You just can't do that. So it took practically all night, I understand, to bring a consensus that, yeah, we cannot have this man open our peace conference. No way. And then they finally came around to that, and then they wrote a letter. And my understanding was that the letter was something to the effect of, our nation is suffering, and the families of the youth killed are grieving, and we need time to reflect on what's happening in our country and why. So to me, these words are kind of like, shame on you, it was a really good, deep letter. And so the president, long story short, didn't come. There were all these threats of the protester on social media. The protesters were saying, circle the Radisson by 8 a.m. They were, trying to get the multitudes again, and they were saying burn down the Radisson Hotel, which is where we were. But once they understood that the president wasn't coming, then that kind of went away. But what we decided to do instead of the opening with the president is we had a big prayer meeting. And we raised the roof of that hotel. It was the most intense, deep prayer meeting I've ever attended. And because we had all these spiritual giants there of all different, we had cardinals, we had sheikhs, we had everybody. And they would come up, read some sacred texts, and then pray, and then everyone would pray. It was about 2 hours, and I believe it had impact. That plus not inviting him. By Wednesday afternoon, he came on national TV again. He had changed completely. He had done a 180, and he said, I concede. I will not back that bill. He said he's offered compassion for the families and that they would have compensation. And he promised that he would have dialogue sessions with the young people, completely like a different guy. So it was really amazing. And I think there's in our world today, there's a lot of stuff going on, right? And it's very disheartening. And so for me, I just hang on to this experience because it was truth to power, and it worked. And I think it was because of the moral stance that was taken, and also the prayer, the power of prayer as well. So then we had this prayer meeting, and I was like, whoa. I was crying the whole time. It pushed a lot of buttons for me because I lived in Africa for 8 years and been through a war, 6 years of war and a coup and all this other stuff. So it brought back a lot of things. And so anyway, I was thinking my meetings would be not very well attended. I mean, at the most, I was expecting 100 people anyway, but now, given these protests, I expected maybe like here, just a handful of people, and I had the speakers from the other countries, and I thought, well, we'll just have a good discussion. Because we had many Kenyans in the hotel the night before, and they were afraid to go home. We had all kinds of cots put up in the ballroom so that they wouldn't have to go home, because there was tear gas all over, roadblocks, and lots of army all over the place. So they weren't too keen to go home. So I was just taking my time on lunch and went to my room where my program was going to be set. And when I got there half an hour before, it was packed. It was jam-packed. And people were standing along the walls. The hotel people were already setting up a screen in another room, to deal with the overflow. I was just astounded. And, God bless the Kenyans, that they came out at the risk of their lives. And there was the most amazing time I've ever had. And I had planned on good moderators of the plenaries, because I wanted to have a very lively discussion and Q&A. But it turned out there was about 375 people there. And many of the people were the young people from the protests. So the discussions were more like heartfelt, many tears and desperate questions. And so I'll never forget that, because even though I've been doing this for a long time, it showed me that you cannot suppress peace. It's gonna come. It cannot be suppressed. Okay. So going back to this is like foundational peace building that I'm sharing today, some basic concepts. So identity-based conflict, like I was mentioning, conflicts are complicated and layered and everything, but yet almost all conflicts you can see through the lens of identity-based conflict. And the worst, of course, is such as ISIS, would be us versus them, if you take it to its end, logical end. So this kind of view of this extreme radical us and them is dehumanizing, and it just cuts off everything. But we have us and them dynamic everywhere, actually, on many, many different levels. But this kind of mentality divides us. It keeps us apart. The us and them, it can be a nationality, it can be ethnicity, it can be race, it can be politics, it can be, you name it. It can create this. And it's important to mention at the same time that having a group, having a culture, having a ethnicity, I'm not saying that that's a wrong, that's a bad thing in and of itself. We need, you can see high up on the pyramid, Maslow's pyramid, we need belonging, this sense of belonging. But we have to be careful that it doesn't become exclusive or superior, or a lot of us and them dynamics are based on historical conflicts, and there's a lot of revenge all mixed around, and a lot of fear. So it's a bad thing. So this is belonging gone wrong, is the visceral kind of us versus them. So even in high school, there's us and them, the teenagers, you know, the in-group, the out-group. I mean, it's everywhere on different levels. So the good news is that in reality, there's only us. The good news is that we already have a shared identity. We don't live there. We don't realize, you know, our compassion even is not locked in, you know, the boundary of our compassion often is our own people. But if we can learn to live within our common humanity, that is our shared identity. And so this is really the root, the core of Global Peace Foundation's peace-building efforts. All comes to this. And our vision statement, is one family under God. So we have a common heritage. Even though we look different, we eat different, we talk different, whatever, we have a common origin and a common heritage. And there are ways, I'm always looking for more ways to create interactive activities which help us to connect with our common humanity. Last week, I was very excited to be able to do a session within the Baltimore Police Academy with the new cadets. There were about 45 cadets that were beginning their 10-week process. And I've become friends with the director, and he was really happy with our session because in the past, police have been actually trained to be us against them. And even if they aren't trained that way specifically, it kind of becomes that. And so somehow we wanted to plant the seed, you know, that we are one family. And when we're doing stuff like that, we don't say under God. We can't go into the spiritual aspect, but because we have, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but because we have these universal principles that we've identified, which are like the global ethic in a sense, I have worked with these principles in many different countries with many different kinds of people, and it is really effective. The universal principles, these like define what our common humanity is, and it establishes. You can take a group of people, and with these principles, you can bring out the common thinking, and establish over time that even within a conference, you can establish relationships based on respect, based on the human dignity of each other. And then with this, you can go to the peace table with oppositional groups, and people can hang in, you know, with sustained dialogue, even with people that hate each other, relationships start to happen. And relationships are really what it's all about in the end. I guess you could say that Global Peace Foundation, our peace building is relational, because it is. So, and then I wanted to say one thing about this slide, is that in a pluralistic society such as ours, we have these universal principles. From them come shared values, and all of our projects are focused on the shared values. So even though the world's religious traditions differ in so many ways, they differ greatly, but they share broad agreements in how we are to live and how we are to treat each other. And this, we call this a civic focus. And if our focus is there, how do we treat each other, then these universal principles can really guide us and bring us together. So that is basically what I wanted to share. And I was thinking, well, first of all, if you have any questions, we can have a little Q&A. We could also come and sit together, and we could do some discussion based on these universals. So does anyone have any questions, first of all? Yeah.
I have a question. One of the things that I found in talking to many of my friends is that they are deeply nihilistic. And if, you're starting from that point, where do you go from there? How do you combat nihilism when you're trying to build bridges between people?
Even the most nihilistic or atheistic or even very self-absorbed, when you start sharing stories, personal stories, like these principles, like I had no idea with these police cadets, if they have faith or not or what. But I took these 4 principles and wrote them on a poster board and put one in each corner of the room, and then I read through them, and I asked the people in the room, which principle draws you? Which principle speaks to you? And go to that principle. So that naturally formed 4 discussion groups of about 10, 12 cadets. And then once they got in their discussion group, I asked them, please reflect on your life and share some personal story about how did you come to know your own sense of value and your own dignity. I mean, I have a story that I shared with the whole group of cadets about an African woman that I met in Rwanda who taught me so much about human dignity. She had more dignity in her little finger than I had and than anybody I'd ever met. And she had been dehumanized, and everyone around her, her husband, her children had been killed, but she held, because of her faith, she held on to her sense of value. So I told that story. But, here's these 45 folks that we didn't know at all. We only spent like 2 hours with them, but I facilitated the discussion group on the first principle here. And people were sharing, very deeply about their, in tears, about their mother who had died, but then, and she had taken care of, 9 kids, and it always happens that, people are able to begin to relate. And as I mentioned before, in our teaching also, I didn't do it today, but we talk a lot about dialogue, how to have dialogue, and dialogue is really more about listening than talking. And so over time, once people are educated about what dialogue is, and they're willing to have dialogue, and they're willing to listen deep enough that they can be changed by what they hear, and really want to understand the other person's viewpoint, even though it's totally different than theirs. Over time, even the most oppositional people start to form a relationship, because you facilitate and you help them talk about stuff that we all what food, what's your Sunday dinner like at home? Or, things, human things. We have a lot of different interactive type of exercises that bring people together on their humanness. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the challenges that people have when dealing with nihilism is that they think there's nothing else, and so they act only for themselves, and they don't see the value in helping anyone, even if there's shared, they say, okay, we're both the same species, but whatever. And that's, I run into a lot of that, unfortunately.
Yeah. The end of the peace building education training that we do is service. And sometimes that can open somebody's heart as well. If they're able to interact sincerely with people, that have a very different circumstance of life, then it can begin to warm them up a bit. But yeah, it's a challenge, for sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
I guess I have a comment. So I'm an astronomer. I don't know if you remember that or not. But one of the things that astronomy does for you is it changes your perspective. It's a very big cosmos out there, turning around, looking back at our little planet. That famous picture of the moon, from the moon above, and the Earth above that, the little part of the picture. You don't see the lines of the different countries or anything on the surface.
Right.
We're all one humanity. We're all together. It kind of goes along with this. But I find that perspective of realizing that this Earth in the cosmos is a small place. It's a special place, and we should be working together to make it better instead of fighting each other over every little thing. To be an important perspective, but it also gets away from the individual, personal level, and kind of opens it up to a very much larger perspective, the global perspective.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's true. I always feel that way when I see the Earth from a distance.
My question is more about what happened in Kenya, especially during that intense prayer and sharing session among the invitees.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just very curious how the word got out. It sounds like somehow the word got out that this was going on and had some sort of impact on the rest of that behavior that was antithetical to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious if you know anything about how that spread.
Yeah, good question. We had maybe 500 people, or I don't know the number exactly, but we had a lot of people in the hotel. The whole hotel was full of our speakers and our participants. So they were the core group of that prayer meeting. But I reckon there was a lot of praying going on everywhere in Kenya, I think it was just kind of a spiritual thing. But because also our partner was the Interreligious Council of Kenya, they were communicating. They had already met with the president 3 days before, and it had expressed their dissatisfaction with this tax bill. And we're saying, how can you support this bill? So they were constantly, I was with them all the time for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and we were always talking, and they were in constant communication with their people, and they were the top of their hierarchy, their church hierarchy, or their Islamic, sheikhs and the sultans, and we had some amazing people. We had top people from African Union, from United Nations, you know, so they were all communicating. So I think that was part of it, but I think it was from the president's point of view, you know, to be rejected. I mean, he had felt originally that it would be a capitulation not to attend the conference, in spite of you know, he was determined to come. But hey, we pulled the invite, so he could not come. And I heard from people around him that he was really shocked because we had the leaders of Africa with us. And like, they don't want to talk to me? You know, so I think it was a combination of things, but I think it was also, you know, just a really spiritual thing, kind of miraculous to my mind. So what I thought was maybe we could sit in a circle and we got like 10 minutes, 15 minutes if you want to share a bit more. I'd be happy to facilitate. Would you like to do that? Come on up, and I think we just make one circle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just need a few more. Well, Diane's, she's got her own chair, yeah. And we could use, someone can sit on the pew as well.